Berlin, spring 1944. Inside the Reich Chancellery, German intelligence officers spread their latest reports across a wide table. Every signal, every intercepted radio transmission, every photograph from their aerial reconnaissance pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans were preparing their most powerful strike, and they had placed one man in charge of it, the general the Wehrmacht feared more than any other Allied commander. The man whose name appeared in German field dispatches with a respect bordering on dread. But the Germans were wrong, completely, fatally wrong. Because on the other side of the channel, that general, the one they were watching, the one they feared, was commanding an army that existed only on paper. A ghost force, a fiction built from canvas and scaffolding and radio static. The real invasion was being planned by a man who had never once led troops into combat. And that decision, made quietly in a Cairo hotel room in December 1943, would determine whether the liberation of Western Europe would succeed or collapse into catastrophe. This is the story of why America's most feared battlefield commander was deliberately kept away from the beaches of Normandy, and why that choice may have been the most brilliant military decision of the entire war. To understand why one general was kept from Normandy, you first have to understand the kind of commander he was, and why the Germans couldn't stop talking about him. By the summer of 1943, few Allied officers had made a more dramatic impression on the battlefield than Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. Born in California in 1885, raised on stories of ancestors who had bled in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, Patton had spent his entire adult life preparing for a war that felt, to him, almost like destiny. He competed in the 1912 Olympics. He led one of the first motorized combat raids in American military history during the Mexico campaign in 1916, personally engaging the enemy with revolvers and returning with the bodies of enemy fighters strapped to the hoods of his vehicles. He established the U.S. Army's first tank school during World War I. He studied warfare the way other men studied scripture, relentlessly, obsessively, with absolute conviction. When America entered the Second World War, Patton was ready. He trained his divisions in the Mojave Desert, pushing men to their absolute limits. He designed training so brutal that soldiers who survived it felt they could handle anything combat could offer. And when the test came, when American forces suffered a stunning defeat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, and a demoralized corps needed someone to restore its fighting spirit, Patton was the one who answered the call. He arrived and immediately made himself impossible to ignore. Uniform standards enforced at all hours. Inspections, aggressive patrolling, forward movement. He didn't just give orders. He appeared at the front, talking to soldiers, visible, volcanic, and absolutely unafraid. Within days, the mood in the unit shifted. Within weeks, American forces were holding their ground against some of the most experienced German veterans in the war. Then came Sicily. Operation Husky, July 1943. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army in a campaign that was supposed to be secondary, his forces guarding the flank of the British advance. He had different ideas. He launched his own drive westward across the island, captured Palermo in a lightning thrust, then turned east and raced British forces along the northern coast to reach the key port of Messina. He arrived first. The Germans had another name for him by then, one that would prove extremely useful to Allied planners in the months ahead. But the Sicily campaign also produced a crisis, one that would ripple outward and alter the course of an entire war. On two separate occasions in August 1943, Patton visited military hospitals and encountered soldiers diagnosed with what doctors called combat exhaustion, the psychological collapse that comes from sustained exposure to extreme fear and violence under fire. Patton did not believe in it. In his view, courage was a choice. Suffering was something to be pushed through. He confronted these soldiers. He berated them. On the second occasion, he struck a hospitalized soldier and threatened him at gunpoint. Medical staff were horrified. Reports traveled up the chain of command. Within weeks, the incidents were in the hands of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower faced a genuine dilemma. Patton was arguably the most effective combat commander the Allies possessed. Removing him from the war entirely would be a significant blow. But allowing the incidents to go unpunished would be a different kind of failure. He ordered Patton to apologize, personally and directly, to the soldiers he had struck, to the medical personnel who had witnessed it, and to every division under his command. Then Eisenhower waited, watching what the political fallout would bring. When American radio broadcaster Drew Pearson broke the story publicly in November 1943, the reaction was immediate and intense. Some Americans backed Patton. Others demanded his removal. The story landed in Congress, it landed in the press, and it landed at the worst possible moment in the middle of the most important command decision of the war. Because at exactly that moment, in November and December of 1943, Allied leaders were meeting in Cairo and Tehran to finalize the plan for the invasion of France, and to decide who would lead it. Three men dominated the discussion of who would command Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. The first was George Marshall. Born in Pennsylvania in 1880, Marshall had spent his career building a reputation so formidable that by 1939, President Roosevelt had passed over dozens of more senior officers to make him Army Chief of Staff. He took that job on September 1, 1939, the same day Germany invaded Poland. What he found was an army of roughly 174,000 men, ranking 17th in the world, smaller than Belgium's. He transformed it. He navigated Congress for appropriations. He created training centers across the country. He inducted and prepared millions of soldiers. He managed the complex politics of alliance with Britain, the rivalry with the Navy, and the different strategic visions pulling American war planning in competing directions. Most importantly, Marshall became the architect of a plan to strike directly at Germany through France. When the British favored peripheral campaigns through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, Marshall pushed back steadily and persistently. The fastest path to defeating Hitler, he argued, ran directly across the English Channel. By 1943, he had secured a commitment to Overlord with a target date of May 1944. He had conceived it. He had fought for it. Logically, he seemed to be the one who should command it. Churchill called him the organizer of Allied victory. Stalin trusted him. Roosevelt relied on him absolutely. The expectation, inside the military, in Congress, among Allied leaders, was that Marshall would receive the appointment. The second man was Eisenhower. Born in Texas in 1890, raised in Kansas by a family of modest means, Eisenhower had entered West Point not out of military passion, but because the education was free. He graduated ranked 61st out of 164 cadets in the class of 1915, the class that would later produce 59 generals. Where Patton had been drawn toward the sword, Eisenhower had been drawn toward the map table. He spent the years between the wars attending the Army's best staff schools, graduating first in his class at Fort Leavenworth. He worked for Pershing. He served under MacArthur in the Philippines, learning how to navigate enormous egos, political pressures, and coalition relationships. When war came, Marshall sent Eisenhower to London as the senior American commander in Europe, a remarkable choice for a man who had never commanded troops in battle. But Marshall saw something others missed. Eisenhower possessed an unusual talent for making people from different nations, with different priorities and different temperaments, work together toward a shared objective. He had proven it in North Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942. Politically complex, diplomatically treacherous, involving French forces of uncertain loyalty, British and American commanders with different strategic preferences, and the ever-present risk of coalition collapse. Eisenhower managed it all. He wasn't the best tactician in the theater, but he might have been the best coalition commander alive. The conferences in Cairo and Tehran, November and December 1943, brought the decision to a head. Stalin demanded to know who would command Overlord. Churchill wrestled with it privately, and Roosevelt found himself caught between honoring Marshall and the cold logic of where Marshall was most valuable. The problem was simple and irresolvable. Marshall was indispensable in Washington. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral William Leahy, the other members of the Joint Chiefs, argued that removing Marshall from Washington would damage the American war effort more than his absence from Europe would help it. He coordinated the Pacific Theater. He managed industrial mobilization. He maintained congressional support. He kept multiple campaigns functioning simultaneously across 2 oceans. Roosevelt sent his advisor Harry Hopkins to sound out Marshall directly. Marshall refused to state a preference. Whatever the president decided, he would support completely. On December 5, 1943, Roosevelt invited Marshall to a private meeting. By one account, he asked Marshall directly what he wanted. Marshall gave the same answer he had always given. Personal ambition could not enter into a decision of this magnitude. Roosevelt reportedly responded with a quiet admission. He could not sleep at night with Marshall out of the country. 2 days later, on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt sent a message to Eisenhower. It was brief. It said, "You are to command Overlord." Eisenhower later described the moment as one of the greatest surprises of his career. He had assumed Marshall would be appointed. He had been mentally preparing to take over Marshall's position in Washington. Instead, he would plan and execute the largest military operation in history. The reasoning, once articulated, was clear. Overlord was not primarily a battle. It was an organizational and diplomatic challenge of staggering complexity. It required coordinating forces from multiple nations with different command structures, different equipment, different strategic preferences, and competing institutional cultures. It required maintaining political support across governments. It required a supreme commander who could hold a fractious coalition together under the extreme pressure of combat operations. That was Eisenhower's gift. Not the sword, the conference table. Not the charge, but the coalition. Which brought everyone back to Patton. Sidelined by controversy, kept from supreme command, but still the most feared American battlefield commander in German eyes. Allied planners faced a strategic problem. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. The question was where. The most obvious answer, the most geographically logical answer, was the Pas de Calais. It was the narrowest crossing point in the Channel. It was the most direct route toward Germany. Every strategic argument pointed there. The Allies were actually planning to land at Normandy, 100 miles to the west. The beaches were better, the terrain offered more room to maneuver, and German defenses, while formidable, were less concentrated there than at Calais. But the deception would only hold if the Germans believed the main invasion force was preparing to hit Calais, and kept believing it, even after the Normandy landings began. If Hitler moved his armored reserves to Normandy immediately, the invasion might fail at the water's edge. Allied intelligence created a fictional army, officially designated 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. On paper, it consisted of dozens of divisions preparing to storm Calais. In reality, it was fake radio transmissions, dummy equipment, and double agents feeding controlled information into German intelligence networks. The deception needed a commander whose appointment would make the threat completely credible. There was one obvious candidate. Patton became the commanding general of an army that did not exist, and it worked beyond anything the planners had dared hope. German intelligence tracked FUSAG obsessively. Their aerial reconnaissance photographed the dummy landing craft. Their signals intercept units recorded the radio traffic. Their agents, who were actually under British control through a counterintelligence program called the Double Cross System, confirmed every detail of the fictional buildup. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when later asked about Allied commanders, reportedly named Patton as the most dangerous. German doctrine held that the Allies would use their most capable combat general for the most important operation. Therefore, wherever Patton was, the main invasion would land. The logic was unassailable. It was also exactly what Allied planners wanted them to believe. In May 1944, Allied intelligence arranged one final flourish. A German general named Hans Kramer, who had commanded an armored division in North Africa before his capture, was being repatriated due to poor health. Before his departure, he was invited to dinner with Patton. Throughout the evening, Patton mentioned Calais preparations. Afterward, Kramer was driven through what he was led to believe was southeastern England, the staging area for the Calais assault. He was actually in southwestern England, looking at real overlord preparations. When Kramer reached neutral Sweden and reported to German intelligence, he confirmed what they already believed. Patton was there. The invasion was coming. Patton's most significant contribution to D-Day happened months before D-Day. He never fired a shot. He never crossed the channel. His reputation alone, deployed deliberately and brilliantly, tied down German reserves that might otherwise have destroyed the Normandy landing. While Patton waited in England, Eisenhower worked. The operational plan he inherited called for 3 divisions landing on a narrow front. Eisenhower reviewed it and immediately recognized the problem. 3 divisions on a narrow front were too easy to contain and counterattack. He pushed for 5 divisions on a broader 50-mile front. That required more landing craft, more air support, more resources that were already stretched thin across multiple theaters. He negotiated for them. He argued with Churchill. He worked the combined chiefs of staff. He got what he needed. He personally visited every division that would participate in the assault: American, British, Canadian. Thousands of individual conversations with soldiers who were about to carry out his orders. Soldiers responded to something in him that was easy to miss on paper: genuine warmth, visible concern, and the unmistakable sense that their commanding general understood what he was asking them to do. When weather forecasters told him that the invasion window was closing, that June 5th was impossible due to storms, but June 6th offered a brief and uncertain improvement, Eisenhower gathered his commanders and made the call. He later wrote that it was the loneliest decision of his life. That evening, he visited the 101st Airborne Division at their airfield. These paratroopers would drop into Normandy hours before dawn. Their casualties were expected to be severe. A photographer captured the moment. Eisenhower speaking with a young lieutenant among men whose faces showed exactly what they were feeling. After the visit, he returned to headquarters and wrote a message. He folded it and kept it in his pocket. It accepted full personal responsibility for failure, if failure came. It said the troops had done everything bravery and devotion could accomplish. If any blame attached to the attempt, it was his alone. At 6:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, Allied soldiers stormed 5 beaches across 50 miles of Normandy coastline. Nearly 7,000 vessels, over 11,000 aircraft. By nightfall, approximately 156,000 men had landed on French soil. Casualties totaled roughly 10,000, with the heaviest losses at Omaha Beach, where fierce resistance nearly threw the assault back into the sea. But the beachheads held. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. And in England, Patton learned about it from the BBC. He was devastated. The Germans responded to the Normandy landings, but with only a fraction of their available strength. Hitler, convinced by everything he had seen and heard, refused to release his armored reserves. German intelligence was still reporting that Fusag was poised to strike Calais. Normandy, they told him, was a diversion. For 7 weeks after D-Day, significant German armored forces remained near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never arrive. Allied planners had hoped the deception might buy them 2 weeks. It gave them 7. Every German division held in reserve near Calais was 1 fewer available to drive the Allies back into the sea at Normandy. The beachhead stabilized. Supply lines were established. Reinforcements crossed the channel. British double agents continued feeding false intelligence into German networks throughout this period, describing FUSAG preparation schedules and explaining why the Calais assault had been delayed. The reports were believed. The mathematics were staggering. 7 weeks of misdirected German reserves, all because one general, sidelined, frustrated, listening to radio broadcasts in England, had a reputation so fearsome that his mere presence somewhere was enough to anchor an entire German strategic calculation to the wrong location. Patton's absence from Normandy was his most decisive contribution to the battle for Normandy. On August 1st, 1944, the waiting ended. Operation Cobra had broken the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô. Through that gap poured Patton's Third Army, which officially became operational that day. And everything the German High Command had feared about him became immediately, devastatingly real. Patton moved faster than German commanders thought possible. His armored divisions appeared in unexpected places, bypassing strong points, surrounding enemy units before they could react or withdraw. Third Army drove west into Brittany, then wheeled east toward Paris, then turned northeast toward the German border. In 30 days, Third Army covered ground that Allied planners had estimated might take 6 months. By August 25th, American soldiers were entering Paris. By month's end, Patton's forces had liberated vast stretches of France and taken hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Then came December 1944, Hitler's last gamble. 3 German armies struck through the Ardennes forest on December 16th, creating the crisis that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces pushed deep into American lines. The 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded at Bastogne, a critical crossroads town. If Bastogne fell, the German advance could split the Allied line. Eisenhower turned to Patton with a task that seemed impossible. Disengage Third Army from its current operations, pivot 90 degrees north, attack into the southern shoulder of the German advance, relieve Bastogne. Do it as fast as possible. When Eisenhower asked at the Verdun Conference on December 19th when Patton could attack, Patton said December 22nd. 3 days. Eisenhower was openly skeptical. Pivoting an entire army in 3 days through blizzards, in winter conditions, against active opposition, was not how armies moved. Patton had already planned it. His intelligence officer had detected the German buildup and briefed him weeks earlier. He had ordered contingency plans prepared. When the order came, he simply called his chief of staff and gave the code word for the operation they had already rehearsed. Third Army attacked on December 22nd. It drove 3 divisions north through some of the worst winter conditions of the entire European campaign. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The relief of Bastogne may have been the single most impressive operational maneuver in the American contribution to the European War. From March through May 1945, Third Army raced through Germany. Patton's forces captured Trier, then sent back a legendary response to headquarters, which had suggested bypassing it. Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back? His forces were among the first to liberate Nazi concentration camps, the horrors of which Patton documented meticulously and forced local German civilians to witness. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Third Army had liberated or conquered approximately 81,500 square miles of territory across 6 countries. They had captured roughly 1.28 million prisoners and inflicted an estimated 500,000 casualties on German forces, while sustaining proportionally fewer losses than most other Allied armies. Patton's conviction that aggressive offense saved lives had been validated by the numbers, but Patton would not survive the peace. In October 1945, his statements about former Nazi officials and his increasingly vocal hostility toward the Soviet Union led Eisenhower to relieve him of Third Army command. On December 8, 1945, his staff car collided with an American military truck near Mannheim. The crash left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. He was buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers he had commanded, his grave marked with the same plain white cross as every man who had served under him. Marshall continued in public service after the war. President Truman sent him to China in 1945, then appointed him Secretary of State in 1947. In that role, Marshall proposed a program of massive American economic assistance to rebuild Western Europe's shattered economies, the European Recovery Program, quickly known simply as the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, the United States provided more than $12 billion in aid to 16 nations. The Marshall Plan helped prevent economic collapse, rebuilt prosperity that undercut communist political appeal, and established the foundation for decades of European stability. In 1953, Marshall became the only professional soldier ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. His presidency reflected the same qualities that had made him an effective supreme commander: strategic thinking, coalition management, organizational discipline. He ended the Korean War, navigated Cold War tensions without nuclear escalation, and established the infrastructure and strategic frameworks that guided American policy for a generation. What the three men accomplished together: Marshall providing strategic framework from Washington, Eisenhower managing coalition operations in Europe, Patton providing the tactical excellence that turned strategic opportunity into decisive victory, could not have been achieved by any one of them alone. Each served where his specific capabilities had maximum effect. Each was indispensable in his role. And the combination of all three, each contributing something the others could not, produced results that altered the history of the 20th century. So why was America's most feared battlefield commander kept out of Normandy? Because D-Day was not a battle. It was an organizational achievement of almost incomprehensible complexity. The coordination of 3 million personnel, nearly 7,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and the political machinery of multiple sovereign nations, all aimed at a single objective across one of the most heavily defended coastlines in history. That required someone who could hold alliances together under pressure, someone who could make British generals and American generals and Canadian generals and French generals all pull in the same direction without any of them feeling humiliated or undermined. Someone who understood that in coalition warfare, the relationship is the mission, because without the relationship, there is no mission. Patton could not have done that. His genius was for movement, aggression, and tactical shock. He was exactly the commander you wanted once the breakout began, once the gates were open and speed and violence of action were the deciding factors. He was devastating in that role. He may have been the finest operational commander in the American experience of the Second World War, but Overlord needed Eisenhower. It needed patience, diplomacy, organizational mastery, and the particular kind of courage it takes to make a decision, the right decision, when the consequences of being wrong are measured in tens of thousands of lives. Roosevelt understood that, and his decision, quiet and largely unheralded, shaped everything that followed. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe for more histories of the decisions that changed the world. And if you want to dig deeper into the commanders, the strategies, and the hidden machinery behind the Allied victory in Europe, the next video is waiting for you.